So before I begin, I want to ask some questions. And I want you guys to answer truthfully. Have any of you ever felt embarrassed talking about men's issues? And raise your hand if you felt embarrassed. Okay, that's great, because that means I'm not the only one. Have you ever felt ashamed to identify as a men's rights activist or a men's issues advocate or somebody who talks about men's issues? Have you ever felt despair over the size of the change that we're trying to create? All right, I think that's pretty much all of us, so let's begin. We've all talked extensively about the red pill and the blue pill. The red pill being enlightenment and finding out the truth about society and the reality that you live in. And the blue pill being staying in the delusion. A black pill has also sort of entered the conversation, and it's been identified as the moment when you realize you can do nothing to change anything at all about men's issues. And I'm going to talk about my black pill experience. In 2015, I did a podcast with a young man named Alexander Kopakov, otherwise known as the Skeptic Feminist on YouTube. So he identified as a feminist and a skeptic. The first podcast I did with him, I told him that reducing women down to victims was harmful. It creates something people researching toxic charity, that is charity that harms more than it helps, calls poverty of being. It's the inability to feel like you have power to do for yourself. And I told him that I felt that that's what feminists were doing to women. He got really angry with me. I'm talking years of Twitter stalking, making podcasts about me, making YouTube videos about me angry. And he would insist that I hated women and I was the exact opposite of radical feminists, but just for men. And then when I questioned the rush to judgment, because we'd had a long association at this point, and when Cologne happened, I started to question the rush to judgment, the allegations that were numerous Muslim migrant men were engaging in gang rape and sexual assault. And I wanted to wait till the evidence came out and due process had concluded, because I just didn't feel like coming to a conclusion at that point. I didn't feel like I had enough information. At the same time, I'd also been talking about the ways in which radical Islam harms men, as well as women. He started to attack me based on those two events for my alleged, what he termed, Islam apologia. By drawing attention to male victims of radical Islam, I was engaging in excusing it. In saying Islam has more victims than most people recognize, I was making excuses for it. So it's like a serial killer has 50 victims, and I said, no, I think he had 100. Oh, you're apologizing for his behavior. Like, no, I don't think so, but okay. His baffling accusations that by saying radical Islam has 2 times more victims, I'm actually saying it's more benevolent, got me pretty confused. It was a thorn in my mind, but it took a few more puzzle pieces for everything to fall into place. In 2011, The Guardian wrote an article about men being raped in wartime. The article describes how men aren't simply just raped, but subject to horrific sexual torture. The article reports on the work of the Refugee Law Project, an organization that helps victims of wartime rape. Men are actually victims of wartime rape at a rate comparable to that of women. But organizations trying to help male rape victims encounter not just silence about the problem, but outright anger that they would even bring it up. The Guardian article continues with an interview of Chris Dolan, director of the Refugee Law Project, a project that works to get victims of wartime rape medical help. The RLP produced a documentary in 2018 called Gender Against Men. When it was screened, Dolan says there were attempts made to stop him. And when he was asked if the attempts were by people in well-known international aid agencies, he said yes. Quoting Dolan, "There's a fear among them that this is a zero-sum game, that there's a predefined cake, and if you start talking about men, you're going to somehow eat a chunk of this cake that has taken them a long time to bake." Dolan talks about a zero-sum game. I disagree. This isn't a zero-sum game that we're dealing with. This isn't a game pitting male victims against female. It's a negative-sum game. The negative-sum game goes as follows. If a social problem is perceived to primarily affect women, we care. If it's perceived to affect women because they're women, we care even more. If a problem affects 50 women, it'll get funding. If it's seen to also affect an additional 50 men, the funding isn't split between the two groups, it's yanked entirely. And we stop caring about solving the problem. Even if that means leaving those 50 female victims out in the cold. The moment men's issues advocates get male victims of a problem recognized, people lose all motivation to help all victims of that problem, including the women. That's the negative-sum game. In a twisted way, it makes sense that Alexander thought I was an apologist for radical Islam, to him, by bringing the attention to how Islam hurts men. I was making the overall harm radical Islam does seem less important, less dire. Up to that point, I had never met anyone who put it quite so plainly as he did. But when everything clicked about this entire situation, I realized he hadn't been the only one operating under the same set of emotional rules. When I started all this, when I started advocating for men's issues, I thought logic and reason and justice would win the day. Now I realize, because of the negative-sum game, they won't. That is my black pill. In the book, Crossing the Chasm, I did it. In the book of Crossing the Chasm, Marketing and Selling Disruptive Products to Mainstream Customers, Thomas More describes the marketing landscape for disruptive technology. More is talking about products in the high technology field, but much of his analysis is applicable to any disruptive idea, including men's rights. Before Moore's analysis, this bell curve, so nice smooth thing, this bell curve used to represent what people thought about the adoption of disruptive technology. The adoption cycle was believed to be a smooth and continuous transition from one market segment to another, from the early adopters to the laggard tail end. When companies got to this first point in the adoption cycle, they would scale up, increasing their spending, making new hires, and expanding inventory in anticipation of exponential growth in sales. And then time and time again, that exponential growth wouldn't appear. And the companies would be just been weeks before been celebrating with lavish parties and champagne by the bucketful, would find themselves scrambling to plug holes in the bottom of a ship that was suddenly taking on water. And then their company would sink below the waves, shipwrecked by some invisible force. How does this happen? Why do companies just about to take off end up tanking instead? Each section of the cycle represents a different attitude towards the potential inconvenience and discomfort involved in adopting a disruptive technology. The first market for a new technology is the innovators and the disruptors, the early adopters, the people who are eager to embrace the new because it is new. The second is the visionaries. These people who can see how a new technology can revolutionize how they do business. The third segment is the early majority, the pragmatists. They're only interested in a technology once it's proven to improve productivity, and they want to invest only in technology leaders that have full support of the marketplace. Then there's the late majority, the conservatives. The conservatives aren't as comfortable with new technology as the pragmatists, so they wait until the learning curve is as flat as possible before adopting it. Then there are laggards. They don't want it, screw you for making it. The reason why promising new technologies tank is because there is a chasm between first adopters, innovators and visionaries, and the early majority, the pragmatists. First adopters will embrace a new idea, a new technology, because it's new. The early majority only embraces it if it has social proof. In this case, social proof is your technology being used by other pragmatists, which creates a catch-22. How do you sell yourself to the marketplace if selling to yourself to the marketplace requires selling already having been sold to the marketplace? Men's rights constitutes a disruptive, what I would call social technology. Disruptive technologies are those technologies that are discontinuous from what has come before it. Some technologies have slow advances that don't require people to change their behavior. Disruptive technology requires a radical change in behavior. For example, all of the behavioral changes required to transition from horse-drawn carriages to automobiles. As for what a social technology is, human beings are super social. There is no other species like us. You put us in little boxes, and you stack us up, and we love it. It's a city! Other animals would be tearing each other's faces off. Compared to us, our nearest relatives, chimps, are extreme individualists to the point of being sociopaths. I mean, in our terms. In their own terms, they're just chimps. We live in extensive, complex, and very abstract systems of reciprocal altruism. Language is a system of reciprocal altruism because you avoid lying even when it would benefit you, so you can enjoy the greater benefit of being able to rely on other people's words when you need to. Language is one of the most fundamental systems of reciprocal altruism. But like language, money is also a system of reciprocal altruism. So is transit, supermarkets, roadways, and the list goes on and on. All systems of reciprocal altruism that we rely on to survive. We all have little voices in our head saying things like, don't be a thief, don't be a liar, don't be rude. Those little voices represent the individual maintaining the pro-social habits that, if all individuals follow, create smoothly functioning systems of reciprocal altruism that we all benefit from. So our identities represent that we've sacrificed something to buy in, but we're also entitled to enjoy a ride on our crazy train called a society. Now, when it comes to a gender, the identity for men is save women, or save those vulnerable creatures women advocate for, such as children, minorities, and animals. This is the identity that men put their own needs aside to embody, that of savior. It's how they feel that they've earned their ticket to society. The identity for women is more about feeling valued when you're being served, or saved and served, and there's a sacrifice in that, but we'll come to that later. The current marketplace for social technology is defined by giving men a sense that they have earned their ticket to participate in society. Men are told and tend to learn that they need to earn a ticket, whereas women, not so much. So men are always on the lookout for ways to earn that ticket. Anita Sarkeesian noted that the damsel in distress trope sells games. It sells games, it sells books, it sells charities, and it sells political movements. Feminism is a profitable monopoly in this marketplace. It's managed to leverage a number of resource extraction operations to increase its overall female victimhood holdings, namely its exploitation of victimhood commodities in minority communities via the intersectional pipeline and the regressive stack. Feminism even uses the strip mining wasteland it leaves behind in minority communities as an excuse why more feminism is needed. Men's rights is trying to not just disrupt an entrenched market leader, it's also trying to rewrite the rules of the marketplace entirely. We're trying to change how people get tickets. Instead of defining themselves as the saviors of others, men's rights asks men to consider that they may need saving. It's also asking women to let go of feeling entitled to tickets and do a little saving of their own in order to earn their gender identity as women. This means men's rights is beyond a simple disruptive technology like automobiles and computers and Segway. Men's rights is asking men and women to question fundamental aspects of how they structure their own identities. If you're on this side of that chasm, and you've got here not because you're the disagreeable type of person who questions everything and questions things even harder when someone tells them that they can't, if you're here because of something that happened to you, that ripped the blindfold off, think about how much pain you had to experience before you started questioning those fundamental aspects of your being. A lot. Can you really expect others to just accept what you're saying if you yourself had to go through something traumatic to do so. We perceive our identities as our ticket to take part in our systems of reciprocal altruism. As human beings, our access to those systems of reciprocal altruism is part of our survival instinct. When we lose our ticket, we feel abandoned. And because we feel abandoned and we are a supersocial species, that means death is imminent. The negative-sum game exists because of the pressure to give men ways of serving women in order to earn a ticket to participate in our systems of reciprocal altruism. That's what men want. That's why the most motivating and effective victimhoods are the ones that are seen to only affect women, not men. The more male victims of the issue, the less motivated we become about that issue. And in turn, women feel like their tickets are being validated when they're being saved as women from distress and danger. In the men's rights movement, we're asking everyone to hand in their tickets. When handing in your ticket is an experience akin to dying. So we're just give up your ticket. What do I get in return? Oh, you can be awesome. Jazz hands. Oh, maybe not today. All right. Okay, sorry. This brings us to the silver pill. That was the black pill, chasm and the black pill. This is the silver pill. 6 months after he became CEO of Aluminum Company of America, Paul O'Neill's phone rang in the middle of the night. O'Neill had made company history by putting workplace safety as his #1 priority at Alcoa when he assumed leadership, despite the skepticism of his executives, shareholders, management, and even the employee unions. In the middle of the night call was from a frantic plant manager in Arizona. One of the extrusion presses in his factory had stopped working, and an employee had attempted a dangerous repair. The worker was a young man eager for a job at Alcoa because it offered health care for his pregnant wife. The worker had leapt over a yellow safety wall, found a bit of scrap wedged into the mechanism of a swinging 6-foot arm. He managed to get it free, and the arm restarted its arc. When it hit the young man's head, it crushed his skull and killed him instantly. Within 14 hours, Paul O'Neill had brought all of his executives into an emergency meeting. If O'Neill was the usual CEO of an industrial giant like Alcoa, he might have expressed his regrets over the tragedy and offered the young man's widow a generous settlement for her loss. But he wasn't. Instead, O'Neill said to his assembled executives, "We killed this man." He went on to say, "This was my failure of leadership. I caused his death. And it's the failure of all of you in the chain of command." The executives were taken aback. Alcoa was a huge company. The employees dealt with hot metal and dangerous machines. Surely such a tragic accident was to be expected. It was just the cost of doing business. But O'Neill insisted that they take personal responsibility, that he take personal responsibility. And that fact shook them up, and they realized he was serious. Within weeks, Alcoa had repainted the safety rails yellow, bright yellow, and new policies were written up. New training programs were instituted that emphasized that employees would not be held responsible for breakdowns, like the one the young man had experienced. Managers told employees not to be afraid to suggest proactive maintenance, and new rules were drawn up to prevent unsafe repairs. Within weeks, there was a noticeable decline in injury rates. O'Neill had spent his career studying how organizations fall prey to habits that can either help or hinder their success. He eventually realized that changing one habit could often create a cascade effect that changed an entire institution for the better. These were the keystone habits. But how do you select a keystone habit? O'Neill might say that he chose workplace safety, better termed workman safety, because he knew that to pursue that goal would mean revamping an entire corporate culture. But why workman safety? Why men's safety? At Alcoa, in fact at every industrial company, workplace death and injury is considered just a fact of life, an unavoidable consequence of the job. But the truth is, it isn't and it wasn't. Rather than fix inefficient processes, broken machinery, or even develop cooperation between departments, executives and management of companies would just allow men to die because their deaths didn't matter enough to them to change their institutional habits. O'Neill refused to accept that at Alcoa. Instead, he made his executives himself personally responsible for any death or injury that occurred on their watch. And they got it. Prior to O'Neill assuming leadership at Alcoa, Alcoa had been losing customers and profit to competitors. The company itself was fractious and divided. Top-down mandates to increase productivity had caused numerous strikes and resentment, to the point where workers were bringing dummies dressed as managers and burning them in the parking lot. Does that sound like anything to you? After O'Neill became CEO, the workplace injury rate fell to a 20th of the national average. At the same time, Alcoa reported record profits, with their income 5 times higher by the time O'Neill retired. There's a lot of lessons to take from O'Neill's tenure at Alcoa, but the one I want you to take here is this. We might consider workman safety to be a men's issue, but it was an Alcoa issue. It was an industry issue. Alcoa was suffering from deeper systemic problems that remained unaddressed while executive and management decided the cost of doing business included dead and injured men. When O'Neill changed their priorities, he changed their tolerance of that cost and forced them to address the issues they were using men's lives to paper over. In our society, in every society, we have a habit of using men's lives and well-being as duct tape to hold together systems that are broken. If there's a problem, we look at men and say, hey, they need to earn their ticket. Take away their autonomy. Give them a line about manliness and throw them into the fire. Advocates for men's issues aren't fringe crackpots. Like O'Neill, we simply recognize the habits that society has fallen into that are fatally dysfunctional, and we've recognized the keystone habit that needs to be changed. Recognition of men's issues. The biggest delusion of all is that men's issues only affect people in the men's rights movement. They affect everyone. Everyone is suffering these issues, and that suffering is only going to get worse. Recognizing how you have been harmed, hurt, or have suffered an injustice doesn't make you a victim. In fact, not recognizing such things when they are manifestly true makes you a perpetual victim, not just of the injustice, but a victim of your own delusions. Recognizing an issue and saying, that issue makes me powerless, is being a victim. Do men's issues make us powerless? Look at the people in this room. Some of you have been motivated to come halfway across the globe. Many of you have dug deep to support this conference, others to support us, the Honey Badgers, being here, among other things. You made this happen. We're here, we're present, you're here, you're present, you're fighting. Are you victims of men's issues? Absolutely not. You don't just recognize men's issues, you've let them come in, you've let them become part of who you are, they've let them motivate you. On this side, on this side of the chasm, on this side of the chasm, we've done the supposedly impossible. We've left the chasm. We've risen above the negative-sum game. The silver pill is realizing that everyone who is part of these men's issues communities is not a victim of men's issues. Everyone in society, everyone else in society is, because they're still stuck with them and they have no solution. And this brings us to the chill pill. At a comics convention a few years ago, I spoke with a webcomic creator who had created a fairly popular comic. I won't be saying his name or his comic because I know I'd be opening him up for a world of hurt. He walked over to my booth because a friend of his had bought my graphic novel, and he had read a few pages and gotten intrigued by the story. We spoke briefly on the subject of social justice, and I learned he considered himself a social justice warrior. He told me that he realized I was his ideological opponent in a lot of ways, and then he paused and said, "But I'm not scared of you. Not like those other social justice warriors. I guess that should tell me something." Then he got his copy of Xenospora and scurried off before he could be spotted. That's a man living in misery. He's less afraid of his enemy, me, than he is of his erstwhile friends and fellow community members. He knows that if he steps a hair out of line or violates any of their huge number of constantly evolving norms, he will be evicted from his source of social approval and called a monster. Men can't be heroes without villains. Women can't be damsels without distress. This dynamic not only requires a constant supply of feminist brand victimhoods to ensure women, to save women from, it requires a constant supply of scapegoats to sacrifice, to make women feel valued and men feel like heroes. And so we invent new villainies, new villains, an endless parade of scapegoats who are guilty of increasingly minuscule and trivial crimes, or guilty of nothing at all. I call this process the misery machine, the negative sum game in action. This design is a bit of a misery machine. This save all women at all costs dynamic may have been functional when men needed to save women from bears and starvation, or when the scapegoats are the Germanic hordes across the Rhine and Upper Danube. But when the scapegoat is your best friend who made an awkward pass at a woman she didn't appreciate, or your cousin who said an edgy off-color joke for a shock value, when every single person in society is a potential scapegoat, it is the misery machine will end up obliterating our trust in each other. And with our trust will go the systems of reciprocal altruism we all rely on to survive. But before that inevitable outcome, the misery machine will create misery. It will create bleak and endless suffering and endless churning, anxiety that will consume all hope, all joy, all happiness. The misery machine leaches all joy out of every single social interaction, turning them into potential crimes and sins that need to be called out. Call out culture. Everyone is under constant surveillance for any misstep, and their friends can switch to being their executioners in the space of a single horrified gasp. On the mainstream side of the chasm, though, where the tiger is representing the misery machine. In crossing the chasm, Moore says that when you want to cross the chasm from a first adopter marketplace to the mainstream, pain is your best ally. The mainstream marketplace only adopts new technology when it's too painful not to. All the feminist misery merchants are doing us a favor, amping up the pain on their side of the chasm. They will end up promoting recognition of men's issues as a solution to the pain that they themselves are creating. And while the misery they can inflict on us is limited, the misery they can inflict on the other side is infinite, because they have no way of fighting back. Our feminist competition is actually our greatest ally in selling us, because they may end up creating the very conditions that cause the mainstream to build a bridge to us. Every bit of fun, every hug, every laugh, every moment of joy on this side of the chasm sells us that much more. And our besties on the other side, this is our bestie. Big Red, hand for Big Red. Woo! Good job, Big Red! Our besties on the other side will continue to do their part, helping us out by amping up the pain on their side of the chasm. The chill pill is recognizing that this whole situation puts time on our side. Of course, we're anxious to see positive changes, but we aren't living with an exponentially increasing source of misery. After all, we don't exist in a community where we're less afraid of our so-called enemies than we are of our friends. Going forward, our greatest challenge may not lie with convincing people to come to this side of the chasm, but figuring out what to do with them when they pop up here to escape the misery machine on their side. We've already started to see this. Refugees from the misery machine washing up on our shore and immediately wanting us to make things more comfortable for them. Why do you have to challenge mainstream norms so much? Do you really need to be so anti-misery machine? Why don't you change your name? Yes, some of them are credentialed. They have power in media, government, and law, but they are credentialed in building misery machines. Some of them seem to be under the impression that the way to cross the chasm is to make this side resemble the side that they just fled from. In essence, what they want to bring the misery machine here. And we have to tell them, no misery machine. Which brings us to the white pill. There's a final and rather depressing chapter in the skeptic, feminist, and Alexander Kolpakov story. Alexander Kolpakov allegedly shot his girlfriend, Heather Annabel, to death in May of 2017. I say allegedly because I believe the trial is still ongoing, and as far as I know, but the police have no other suspects, and he's facing a charge of murder in the first degree, which was upgraded to second degree murder, upgraded from second-degree murder during the police investigation. Everything that follows this is my opinion based on the statements made by people who knew Alexander and Heather and my own experience of having interacted with him. That led me to realizing the existence of the negative-sum game. Prior to the shooting, a friend who was close to both said Heather had been expressing a desire to leave Alexander because he was controlling. In fact, other evidence suggests that her family was trying to get her away from him. Then Alexander gave her a wedding ring. It's possible Heather didn't give Alexander the reaction he expected. He ended up shooting her in the back in a parking lot outside their house. It's possible Heather didn't give him the reaction that he had expected. And when it happened, I don't think he had a way to conceptualize the harm except as a threat to his identity. To recognize otherwise would be to give up his identity as savior of women, which was, based on his behavior towards me, chasing me around and really furious that I questioned it for years, very important to him. It's likely that all the value Alexander thought he had. As I said before, we experience a threat to our identities almost the same way as a threat to our lives. Feminists would blame the murder on toxic masculinity or a patriarchal society that encourages entitlement in men. They would likely blame the murder on us. You know that, right? They're probably. But I think the real culprit is a society that gives men no other value but that of savior of others. A society that ignores male victims because they aren't marketable. The real culprit is a society in the thrall of the negative-sum game. Alexander was a victim of that, and Heather was a victim of that. Without knowing it, Heather was punching Alexander's ticket. She probably had no idea that that was what she was doing, and because he was controlling, possibly narcissistic, that meant he lashed out violently. And that's the other thing the negative-sum game and the misery machine does. It creates men who are ticking time bombs. And I want to stop for a moment, because when I say something like that, I want to show something else. I'd like everybody in this room who's been personally affected or had a friend or a relative or even experienced suicidal ideation, I would like you to, a man, I'd like you to either raise your hand or stand up. Have you experienced anyone suicide, anyone, of men? Okay. Everyone, if you've ever had a friend, family members, anyone, okay. So we're looking at probably about 50 people, right? Okay. That is far higher number than men will ever kill. Of course, the women will, or the feminists will look at the one man who kills and say that represents all men. I just wanted to give you a visual demonstration of how big this is. Because I don't like bringing up a man who killed without pointing that out. There are tens, 20s of men who kill themselves, and it's because of that instinct to protect. Men like him are rare. When men feel like they've lost their ticket to our systems of reciprocal altruism, they are far more likely to kill themselves, because men's instinctive nature is to protect. The misery machine doesn't just create misery, it also kills. At the beginning of this, I said that I once felt embarrassed, or I implied it because I said I'm with you guys, right? I once felt embarrassed to be a men's rights activist because I felt like I was constantly asking people to attend to issues that only I was concerned with in the room. I felt despair because of the sheer scope of what we're trying to do. And I felt ashamed because of those lingering doubts about, are we really women hating? Now I feel proud to be a men's rights advocate. We've done the work to challenge the negative-sum game and dismantle the misery machine on this side of the chasm. We're doing the work that will prevent tragedies like Alexander and Heather Annable, and the far greater number of men, all of you stood up, who kill themselves when they feel like they've lost their ticket. Compassion for men not only helps men, it brings about true equality. Not equality of outcome or ability, but equality of respect and empathy. Compassion for men means compassion for women that recognizes the good and bad in women, recognizes their individuality and their individual merit. Men's rights means we stop punishing women who fail to play along with men's identities and judge them for the content of their characters. It could have saved one life from being ended, one life from being ruined, and it could have also saved all the many, many, many more men who kill themselves when they feel like they failed to be strong enough, tough enough, enough of a savior. I'm proud of what we've created by embracing compassion for men. I'm proud of the work we've done moving past the negative-sum game, dismantling the misery machine, and building a community of people who are not more afraid of their friends than their enemies. I'm proud of what we've built together. So sit back, chill out, try to laugh at the irony that Big Red is actually our bestie. Because all we have to do to win at this point is throw a party so loud they can hear it on the other side of the chasm. Okay.
Be excellent to each other. And party on, dudes!
Thank you. Let's let them hear it on the other side of the chasm. All
right. Quite honestly, I thought that was the best analysis I've heard this weekend. I think you understand the situation really well. Did I understand you correctly that you think that our best ally are the people who shout the loudest from the other side, and that probably, because this seems to resonate with what I was thinking this morning, that sometimes when when yin turns to yang, when something becomes so ridiculous, it flips, and I feel very optimistic about that. Are you saying that we should perhaps provoke people to make ridiculous
don't provoke them.
responses?
Don't provoke them. That'll provoke them more. But don't quote me on that one. Don't provoke the reaction. I mean, be excellent. Like be good to people. Be the best person you can be. They're gonna do what they do, which is what they do. And we should definitely bring our A game. We should bring our arguments. We should show the people on the other side that we have the arguments to contend with theirs, and that we bring logic and compassion and fun to the equation, because that's what's going to attract them. But don't provoke them. They'll do it themselves.
Yeah, g'day, Alison. Again, I concur. That's probably one of the best talks we've had over the weekend. I've been sort of on a bit of a roller coaster over this weekend. I'm talking to people with an enormous amount of hope, and I've heard some really dystopian visions, which was beautifully represented in what you went there through the various pill colours. Are you optimistic? Are you genuinely optimistic? Because in this room there is some of the
Genuinely
absolute
optimistic?
opposite. Yeah.
Well, I guess I'm optimistic in the way people, when they launch a rocket in NASA, are optimistic. I'm like, yeah, this is going to be awesome. It could also be really fucking horrible. Like, really horrible. But you do your job, you do what you can to make sure that it isn't really horrible, and focus on how you want to advocate, how you want to affect this kind of positive change. Try not to worry about the possibility that the rocket will explode. Just work on what you can control. And in terms of optimism, I don't know if it's optimism so much as I think that this society is going to have to go through the eye of the needle that we sort of represent if it's going to continue to survive. So it's going to have to address these issues. So we're all in it together. Like everybody, the people who are protesting us, we're in it with them. People in London, we're in it. Everywhere around the world, we're all in this together. Nobody's going to escape this issue and the problems that men's issues are hiding, essentially. So I don't know if that's optimism so much as sense of necessity. It's just this is a necessary change. This is, I'm going to do these certain things. I'm going to focus on what I can do, and I'm not going to worry. I'm not going to sit there worrying, is the rocket going to explode? unless there's something I can do to prevent it. So.
Ladies and gentlemen, Alison Tieman. Thank you.